Hey, thanks for showing up today. For you, this is Christine, your friend, who's walking beside you on the path from grief to growth. Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Today, I want to do a little grief education. And what I'm thinking about doing is kind of going back in history and looking where grief, mourning, all of that derives from, who came up with all this stuff and really who gave it a label. And who were the first people that were kind of diving into it and trying to grasp or understand grief. When we think about grief and we actually say the word grief, in all my years of working with people, it just literally scares them. They will look at me and go, "That encompasses so much." To some people, it's encompassing, all these different emotions we feel. Some people actually, when you hear the word grief, you tend to just kind of shut down, or you can feel a veil come over where a mask comes on, and we just are like, "Whoa, that's not a topic we really wanna talk about." Um, and then other people may be looking at it from a different perspective given the experiences they've had in life. So if somebody has repetitively experienced grief, the body and the emotions will physically respond to the word grief. And that's very much like the dirty moments we have here at Grief Uprooted, where I ask people, what are some of your triggers? Those little moments that cause our mind to get scrambled and sprinkle dirt everywhere so we can't understand things. And we got to just process and ground ourselves and bring ourselves back. But let's really kind of educate ourselves on this grief and words and where it came from. So, some people will head for, when we say the word grief, Kübler-Ross and her stages of grief. Now, Kübler-Ross actually created these stages of grief for the dying. Many people, many, have tried to adapt Kübler-Ross's stages of grief with the living. And essentially, they do kind of cross over, but we're living, and that's significantly a big difference. And so the living grief that we are experiencing is very, very different than if we were facing our own death. And Kubler-Ross, who worked with the dying, created 7 stages of grief that she witnessed as an individual was dying. Now, over the years, we have adapted these 7 stages of dying grief to our living grief. But should we have done that? And do they actually fit in society and the grieving of today as we have evolved through generation, through technology, over technology, where our perspective has changed, how we grasp things have changed. So let's dive back down to Freud. But you never thought you were going to hear that in grief and mourning. But Freud was one of the first people that actually started to recognize this process. He called it mourning. And obviously, I am compiling a lot of the knowledge that I've gained over the years. I kind of do encourage you to Google. I know a lot of people don't encourage people to Google. They're always like, "Don't Google that. Don't do that." But when it comes to the history of grief and the meaning of it, this is kind of a topic that not a lot of people have explored. Actually, nobody's explored. I'm not going to lie to you. You know that. You're the person who's grieving with me. Um, so with Freud, when you do Google that on grief, you are going to find some stuff, but he mainly looked at it as mourning, which was a stage, process and stage of losing somebody or losing something. So I'm just going to read this to you because I want to make sure I get it right. Grief is a condition that all humans experience when they lose a loved one. Freud pointed out that this can also apply to the loss of fatherland, freedom, or an ideal. He claimed that it is wrong to regard grief as pathological and something requiring treatment. Grief passes after some time, and upsetting this process unnecessarily may be harmful. By this, Freud meant that we should trust in the human ability to endure stresses and strains and overcome hardship through personal effort. I actually really love the way Freud put this. And Freud was talking exactly about what you and I have experienced or are experiencing right at this moment. And that is that grief, the loss of a loved one, the loss of an ideal. Um, and he recognizes it as that death of something or someone. The level of grief in which one experiences is very, very personal. And we all know that by the relationship we had with the deceased, by what we are actually um, experiencing as a death. I tend to want to avoid the word loss, and you'll notice that. And so I think I should just really explain why I want to avoid the word loss. And that's because a lot of times in working with children, when we say we lost somebody, it indicates into the mind that that person can be found. Now, in saying that, in Where's Robert, my first book, I do say that Robert can be found, and he is within myself. He is within this crazy red hair, these crazy blue eyes. And I see Robert's spirit and memories within my family and children. So, this is kind of why I like to use the word death because it's solid. But now when I explain the meaning for loss, it actually might be okay. But back to Freud. So Freud looked as grief as a process we went through as human beings. He did not look at it as something that we needed treatment. So this actually makes a lot of sense. And Freud is not talked a lot about in grief in general society. Now, who is talked a lot about in grief is Kübler-Ross and those 7 stages of grief. Now, right or wrong, this is what we have done in society. We have taken Kübler-Ross's 7 stages. She did have 5 at the first, and then we adapted and it adjusted kind of along there to 7. So there's 5 or 7 stages of grief. This is dying grief. People have tried to take Kübler-Ross's 7 stages of grief that she created while witnessing somebody dying and what that dying person was going through. So that dying person was going through these 7 stages of grief. At first, they were in denial. No, there's absolutely no way that I could have cancer and be dying. So that denial is there. Who wants to believe that they actually have a terminal illness and they're going to die? You know yourself, just sitting here right now, that's, you want to say insane to even, comprehend or process. But as this person is going through this process of dying, the next thing they hit is great anger. Like, I'm leaving my loved ones. I'm actually dying. This is completely unfair. And that anger rises and rises and rises. Then they get into bargaining, which is, hey, God, or hey, Creator, you know, I'll stop smoking. I'll eat proper. I'll do whatever it takes, thinking that they have that ability to bargain with whatever it may be, the universe, Mother Nature, whatever, to continue to live. So they have that bargaining. And I think part of that, we see people trying all sorts of different techniques to stay alive. And then she says they fall into a depression where that individual who is dying becomes severely depressed because they're falling into acceptance that they're dying and they will never, ever see their family again. as we don't know what comes next. There are many different beliefs, there are many different ideas out there, but right here on earth, we have our own belief systems, each of us. But really, this person is depressed because the reality of the situation has come to light that, you may not see a bird or hear it sing. You may not wake up again to see the sunrise. There's just so many things that that individual who is dying, and I can't even imagine this, to be honest. And I know I'll be faced with it one day, as we all will die. Eventually, from that depression, goes to acceptance that they're dying and they've accepted that they've lived the life they've lived and now they will die. So we've taken that and adapted it to living grief. And then we wonder why society and why people are having such a hard time grieving. See, when we look at grief for the dying, the way Kübler-Ross was, no one wants to talk about grief. No one wants to walk in a room and look at somebody and say, "You're dying," and sit by their bedside and watch somebody they love suffer and die. I know many of us do, but I'm saying that it's hard. So a lot of us, we struggle with this. We struggle to show up for the dying. And then we adapt that feeling of struggling to show up for the dying, struggle with thinking that somebody we love is dying. We adapt that feeling that you feel when you think about dying yourself and how that physically affects us. And we apply that to our living grief. Once that person has died and they're gone, what happens to you as an individual? You see, when someone's dying, we really stop everything we're doing to be with them. That's when our grief starts. Our grief is not starting after a person dies. Our living grief starts when we hear that individual is dying. And if you experience traumatic death in your life, you're just slapped in the face. That's completely different than 7 stages of dying grief. That's why her stages start with denial. A lot of us and a lot of the people on my podcast, when they hear, and they've all been delivered death notifications in the most shocking ways, when they hear about that death for the first time, that shock, that disbelief, that just whacks them. And then they're to grasp on to something that isn't tangible for living grief. And that's why we're having this conversation. That's why I wanted to explore this. Because Kübler-Ross brings so much value and insight and amazing, beautiful woman with an amazing, beautiful family. And what she brought to this world is invaluable when it comes into grief. But is it adapting to what we need? Obviously, these are people I've studied and fascinated by their work. But when we go back to Freud, which we don't hear a lot about, and he talks about this being a human experience, this being a process. Now, a lot of people know I work in a lot of different cultures. Um, and one I've adopted some of their amazing practices is our indigenous cultures. Um, they really have a similar belief when it comes to grief. It's a human experience. Um, And just being able to realize that it's a mind, body, spirit experience alone will help you grieve. But that education needs to be there also. I so appreciate you. I appreciate all your support. And I just want to say, do hit that button. Take a moment and like us on YouTube, please. Like us on Spotify, Instagram, Facebook, however you listen to your podcast, because the more people we reach, the more people will start talking about their grief. I know that people are tuning in from all over the world, and I thank you for your comments and I thank you for your support. But we need to keep moving. We need to get this community needs to grow bigger and bigger and bigger so that we're not just uprooting one plant at a time, we're uprooting trees. And we're talking about the hard stuff. Thank you so much. I love you all, and I thank you for all your support. And it is together that we will walk the path from grief to growth. So, in saying all of this, when we look at we look at Freud and we look at Kübler-Ross, and we were to take those two and put them together, and then we look at cultures, because the indigenous culture very much has a strong belief within it being a human experience. And then when we look into other cultures, there's so many out there that have so many great things to offer when we come to grief. Traditional practices, the practices of wearing black is actually very beneficial for an individual to show the world that they're mourning. It's a way of expressing our grief in our mourning without having to verbalize it. And when we look back in society and we look back into cultures, and I'm even going to throw in religion, all of them have practices for grief. They really do. I know that a lot of times people will say, well, I'm an atheist. They still have human sorrow. And that is expressed in so many different ways. So throughout culture and generations, all of these cultures have been expressing their grief in a different way. All of these religions are expressing their grief in a different way. But when we want to come and bring it really kind of to home and have the conversation at the dinner table, it doesn't work. It's kind of like sexuality. For years, people have been trying to open the door so that we could openly have these conversations about sexuality or even drugs, if we want to add that in. And those are conversations we're having with loved ones. Like, if somebody is a teenager and they're wanting to experiment with drugs, well, how do we have that conversation? How do we bring it to the table? Well, this is really kind of in the same realm of that. How do we bring grief to the table? Um, this kind of brings me back to in high school, I actually did a play for drama class on being an individual who died. And I went through the process that Kübler-Ross had identified as a person who was dead from the other side of life. So, such as a spirit or angel, I was talking to the audience going, "Oh my God, I'm dead." And, as a teenager, taking this moment to reflect on what it would be like if you died and were capable of seeing your loved ones. The play had a huge impact on my drama class. And I remember my teacher, who to this day I still see and talk to, why I chose that. And I said, because I'm fascinated to know what the afterlife is like. Are these people looking at us and going, wow, like they're crying profusely, and what that experience would be like to die. And that's when I started to really dive into this in my early years as to what Freud was thinking, and how he interpreted grief, and then how Kubler-Ross was. And there's so many other people, Carl Jung and dream interpretations, and how that affects grief. So there's so much education that can be found in this, but it's not something that people willingly want to look for. So with Freud, he's looking at it as a process. With Kübler-Ross, her main focus and study was on the actual dying person. And since then, people have tried adapting different programs and figuring out, well, how do we help the grief in society? And how do we help a grieving individual? So in and just recently, actually, and a lot of people in the field of grief have been actually really fighting for a few things in society. One being that in our workforce, that we actually have something that's in the labor laws for bereavement. And it's a period of time that allows an individual to collect themselves and bury their family members in an appropriate manner and time. Presently, there's like 1 or 2 bereavement days. I know that each employer is different. I, being an individual who owns corporations, I understand how hard that is from a business perspective. I also understand how hard it is to run a business when someone you love dies. But just having something a little more tangible for people when something like that happens. Um, but the other thing that we've been kind of fighting for has been getting grief education in schools. And just even adding in after we're teaching children about sexuality or health class, that there is a stage in life if somebody you love dies, or if you experience a breakup with somebody, just explaining really what that process is. And I've been fighting for years to have that encompassed in our educational system. But I'm starting to realize from Grief Uprooted and with your help, which I greatly appreciate, is the reason that's not happening is because we haven't got a grasp on it. We just haven't. We haven't been talking about it enough to be, okay, is this a great model to teach our children? We need to create that model and we have to grasp it. So really, our school systems are doing the best by adapting coaching models, self affirmations, positivity, all these type of things. But it would be great if we could get to the point of adapting a grief model that prepares our children for those future breakups, with partners, for the fact that they will experience a loss, they may experience a miscarriage, so many things that we could prepare them for, um, or at least make them aware of it. I'm not going to say prepare because you know what, we prepare them for so much and sometimes we have to learn it. But the other part of that is that we've been fighting for is not to have grief identified as a mental health issue that needs to be addressed right away. And the reason being is falling back to Freud's definition of that, that this is a natural human process. This is a process that the mind, body, and spirit need to experience and go through. Many of us try to delay the process and successfully do that. And then years down the road, once grief either hits again, so somebody else dies in your life or a significant trauma or change happens, all the grief from the very first experience comes back. Hence why so many people talk about childhood experiences and then they're experiencing things in their adult life and going, wait a minute, I've been here, I felt this. That's because that grief is catching up to us. And really, your mind is essentially protecting you and saying, I'm going to kind of deal all this stuff out when you are capable of handling it. But then when and how, and we're going to explore that, does grief become something that is a mental health issue? So I'm kind of excited about this, that they have decided, the American Psychiatric Association, it is called DSM-5-TR, presents a new diagnosis criteria for prolonged grief disorder. So what does this mean to us? Well, it means we have adapted Freud's belief that this is a process one needs to naturally experience and go through. Perfect. Because it is. I don't suggest going through it on your own. I suggest you listening to Grief Uprooted. I suggest you joining communities, talk, journal. Um, do all of that stuff and in a community with people who support and love you. And this community supports and loves you. So, with saying that, let's explore when it becomes a mental health issue. So, the DSM 5 TR criteria for PGD requires that distressing symptoms of grief continue for at least 12 months following the loss of a close attachment, and that grief response is characterized by intense longing, yearning for the deceased person and/or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the lost person. This significantly impairs your ability to live. And again, you may be sitting there going, okay, Christine, I am grieving right now, and this is significantly impairing my ability to live. And I agree. I agree that this natural human experience that we're going through sucks. It absolutely sucks. Not a great terminology when we're trying to educate each other here, or I'm trying to educate you. And I say you educate me because I learned so much from all of you, because this is an ever evolving experience of grief. Um, but it does. It really does. It's something that you never really prepared yourself for. And even if you did prepare yourself, like I'm prepared in the sense I understand the process, I understand what happens. I still get slapped in the face. I still grieve, I still hurt. But let's go back to figuring out when does it become a grief disorder, a prolonged grief disorder. So when is it? Like, do you hit the year mark and go, okay, well, I'm still crying, so it must be a prolonged grief disorder? No, you don't, because grief is integrated into you. And it takes steps and you watch it kind of flow, really. I often describe it as going down a highway or a river, and there's all these little side turns, so there's a turn or a roundabout where you kind of get off and you have all these emotions and then you get back on the highway. And ultimately, you are heading for resilience, which is being able to bounce back and go, okay, my world and life has completely changed, but now it's time to adapt to a new life and a new way of being. And often that growth from grief, as you grow, you see things much deeper, bigger perspectives. Um, it's quite amazing. And you've seen that in a lot of my guests. So when we're going to go and look at this, again, you can Google this. And I suggest you to do that because when we educate ourselves, things become less scary. I often say we fear what we don't know. So we need to start learning and lessen that fear. So some of the things that you would look at, and this is actually a test for, it's a figure for prolonged grief disorder. And have you lost someone significant to you? Obviously, we have. How many months has it been since the significant other died? So you would write that in. Do you feel yourself longing or yearning for the person who died? And this test obviously gives you the option of not at all, slightly, somewhat, quite a bit, overwhelming. Um, when we look at being able to adapt this to our grief, obviously, we're going to be here at 12 months when somebody has died. And then we're looking at, okay, do you still, after that 12-month period? Because if you were to do this like the month somebody died, I'd have all overwhelm done. But this is after a year. So really take check of where you're at right now and how many months you're in that your loved one died. I remember a podcast that we had, and one of our guests She came on after 5 months of losing somebody, and obviously we took breaks. And if you listen to that episode, um, she actually said, I need a moment," and leaves the camera to collect herself. But she's 5 months into her grief. So her answers would be significantly overwhelmed. But we're looking at this from the perspective of a year or more. So, do you feel yourself longing or yearning for the person who died? Do you have trouble doing the things you normally do because you're thinking so much about the person who died? Do you feel confused about your role in life or feel like you don't know who you are anymore? Feeling like that part of you has died? Again, take into check that this is after a year or so. I feel like number 5, feeling like part of you has died, um, will always be there, but it will be there somewhat, maybe quite a bit, slightly. It's not gonna be overwhelming your everyday life. Do you have trouble believing that the person who has died is really gone? Actually, I've seen in children where, and I've had this witnessed actually, where somebody I love, a family member died, and I remember being out thinking I saw them, and, it was so strange because I was like, "Oh my god." And then all of a sudden I was like, "No, that's not Rose." And, uh, and I thought it was, and I really wanted to run up and say hello, and so this does happen. So again, that would be like, yeah, somewhat. And some days I just wanna believe that they're not dead, but, it's not overwhelming my life. Um, do you avoid reminders that the person who died is really gone? This is where we've implemented those dirty moments because those reminders come up all the time. But if we're physically avoiding those reminders, that's where it can become a little dicey. You've heard some of the dirty moments, like people talking about they don't want to actually go back into a hospital, or I don't drive down a specific highway. But they all talk about the fact on how they ground themselves, and that is part of the dirty moments, how they handle that because they're not avoiding the trigger. They're actually going there, but they've learned ways to process it and move through that grief that's being flooded into them right at that moment. That's why they're called dirty moments. They're able to kind of clear the dirt away and get themselves through the moment. Um, but they do have value because every time we hit that trigger or that dirty moment, we're building resiliency. We can go down that road again, and this time we're showing people that, especially our children, that we're resilient and that yes, this hurts, but we have the ability to care for ourselves. Um, do you feel that you have trouble re-engaging in life? Example, problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. Obviously, first month somebody dies, you are not going to do any of those things. You're obviously going to go, I am overwhelmed. I can't even think clear. But after a year or so that someone has been gone, you must probably will be able to re-engage with your friends. You may not have an interest for future projects right at the that get-go, but you understand that this wouldn't be overwhelming you. Do you feel emotionally numb or detached from others? Obviously, again, with the first stages of grief, a lot of people feel that numbness, and it's kind of like you're in a dream. But a year into your grief, is it overwhelming you still? Is that still causing you an inability to really live and function in life? Do you feel that life is meaningless without the person who died? Do you feel alone and lonely without the deceased? Again, it's all time, and, that's why it's a process of integration, and I really don't feel that people hit all this right away in the first month someone dies. It takes us time to process, and I think new emotions and new things come up every day as we move through our grief, and it's an experience we're experiencing. That's why it's so great to be able to talk, because you're experiencing a new emotion and you're like, what do I do with this? And so when you're in a group environment and people are talking about their grief, and that really isn't like, here's a group environment that we have to go to because we have a mental illness or something. No, this is a group environment that is caring and loving for people who are going through human sorrow. And that comes in so many different forms. So you're getting together with friends and you're sharing stories from each other. We learn so much by sharing stories from generation to generation. So, yes, you're going to feel all these things and they are going to be overwhelming. And that first week, month of grief, but after a year, and that's what we want to keep into perspective here. Have the symptoms above cause significant impairment in social, occupational, and other areas of functioning? So, in looking at all of these, obviously, there's a lot that you go through as to testing to see if you have prolonged grief disorder. But what we're really, what I really kind of wanted to educate you on was where grief sits within this realm. So there is, after a year, an ability for a diagnosis, which then intervention has to really come into play. Like, we need to make sure that somebody is not significantly impaired by their grief. But what about that first year? What about the year after someone dies? We have, like, to recap what we've discussed here, we've discussed Freud's concept of grief and his perspective of grief, which is a normal human practice, and how in society, our cultures, our religions, through generations, have really just rather adapted this as it being a process. But we also adapted Kübler-Ross' amazing work in dying grief and the fear element of that. And what I want to propose is, what if we had a process for living grief? Just think about that for a second. What if we had a process for living grief? What if, instead of looking at this from the perspective of a dying human being, we look at our grief from a living human being? It'd be significantly different. It really would. We can adapt 7 stages of living grief. What are we experiencing as the living after we have watched something or someone we love die? And that's really where I want to go. That's really where I am going to go with Grief Uprooted in my exploration into grief, is creating a process that's a natural human process and being able to give it identity, a meaning for us as the living to walk down this path. And that's going to be my next coming episodes of Grief Uprooted. We're going to explore this a little bit more. Um, I want to give out a huge thank you to my friends, Lori, Linda, for um, having these conversations with me about grief, and you, the listener, for reaching out to me and sharing your concepts and ideas. This summer, I have really taken some time back. You'll notice I've come off social media to really focus on this so that we together can walk this path of grief to growth. And I really believe that we can. And I really believe that we can create something that will help the next generation grasp this even better than us. Until next time, just remember, it is only together that we grieve, and it is only together that we will heal. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.